The Western Front, Autumn 1917. The mud of Passchendaele has swallowed men whole. The air smells of cordite and rot. Along the ragged British trenches, movement means death. A silhouette above the parapet, even for a heartbeat, invites a German bullet. Snipers from elite Jäger units watch through precision optics, their fingers resting easy on their triggers, trained to kill anything that moves. And yet, in this merciless killing ground, something extraordinary is happening. A figure moves, unhurried, upright, along the open ground between the lines. He wears a peculiar uniform, dark and unmistakable. And the German snipers, veterans all, men who have put bullets through steel helmets at 400 meters, do not fire. They cannot bring themselves to do it. The figure is a chaplain, a padre of the British Army. And what he is wearing has, in that strange moment, become a kind of armor. Not steel, not Kevlar, nothing invented in a laboratory, just cloth, tradition, and the shared human recognition of something that both sides, in their deepest moral core, still respected. The cross on his collar, the vestments of a man of God. This is the story of how a uniform, one that soldiers on both sides mocked as impractical, absurd, even theatrical, became one of the most reliably life-saving garments in the entire war, and how the men who wore it walked into the most dangerous ground on earth, often unarmed, and survived. Not always, but often enough that the story deserves telling. To understand why this matters, you need to understand just how lethal the Western Front had become by 1917. German sniping had evolved into something close to a science. Units were trained at dedicated schools, issued with telescopic-sighted Gewehr 98 rifles, and assigned to carefully camouflage positions that they might occupy for days at a time without moving. The kill rate was staggering. British Army records from 1915 and 1916 suggest that sniper fire accounted for roughly a third of all casualties not attributed to artillery, a figure that climbed in static sectors where German marksmen could study the same stretch of trench for weeks, learning the rhythms of life behind the parapet, cataloguing every routine movement. The response from the British side was to restrict movement entirely. Soldiers were forbidden from showing themselves above the trench line in daylight. Periscopes replaced direct observation. Men ate, slept, and waited in the same muddy slot of earth, sometimes for weeks. Medical officers crawled on hands and knees to reach the wounded. Officers communicated by runner rather than walk openly between positions. The war above the parapet was, for the ordinary soldier, almost entirely off-limits between dawn and dusk. Almost entirely. Because there was one category of man who moved through this landscape with a different set of rules, or rather, with a different set of expectations on both sides. The army chaplain, attached to fighting units since the very start of the war, occupied a peculiar position in the psychology of the conflict. He was not a combatant. He carried no weapon. His purpose was explicitly spiritual and pastoral. To minister to the dying, to write to the bereaved, to hold the hands of frightened boys far from home. And both armies knew it. The chaplains of the British Expeditionary Force wore a uniform that made them immediately identifiable at range. Dark cloth rather than khaki, a distinctive cross on the collar tabs, the purple gorget patches that marked their ecclesiastical rank. The whole ensemble was, from a military camouflage standpoint, an absolute disaster. In a war where men were painting their helmets with mud and wrapping their boots in sacking to muffle sound, the chaplain stood out like a vicar at a boxing match. His uniform announced him. It said, clearly and loudly, "This is not a soldier." And that, it turned out, was precisely the point. What emerged, not by design, but by the strange moral logic of industrialized slaughter, was an informal, unwritten, and never officially acknowledged understanding between opposing forces. German snipers, trained to kill British officers as a priority target, found themselves hesitating in the crosshairs when the figure they were tracking wore the marks of a chaplain. Accounts from German soldiers, recorded in diaries and post-war memoirs, describe the same phenomenon repeatedly: the recognition of the uniform, the pause, the lowering of the rifle. One German infantryman, writing to his family in late 1917, described watching a British padre cross an exposed section of ground near the Ypres salient. "He walked as if taking a morning stroll," the soldier wrote. "Several of us had him in our sights. Nobody fired. It would have been wrong." The word he used was unrichtig, not illegal, not forbidden, wrong, a moral category. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps these stories coming. The chaplains themselves were not naive about this. Many of them understood, consciously or otherwise, that their uniform was a kind of protection. But they also understood that it was not a guarantee. German snipers did, on documented occasions, shoot chaplains. The phenomenon was inconsistent, dependent on the individual sniper, the specific sector, the mood of a particular day. War does not operate on clean moral principles, and the men who wore the dark cloth knew that each journey across open ground was a calculated risk. What is remarkable is not that the protection was perfect. It was not. What is remarkable is that it existed at all. That in the most mechanized, dehumanizing conflict in human history to that point, there persisted in the minds of individual German soldiers something that stayed their hand, a residual recognition of the sacred, an instinct, however battered by years of industrial killing, that some targets remained beyond the pale. The British Army Chaplains Department, formally constituted and reorganized in 1916 under Chaplain General Bishop John Taylor Smith, numbered some 3,500 men by the war's end. They served across every theatre, from the Western Front to Gallipoli, from Mesopotamia to East Africa. Their casualty rates were significant. More than 170 British chaplains were killed during the war, and hundreds more were wounded. Several won the Victoria Cross, including the Reverend Theodore Bailey Hardy, who was awarded the VC-DSO and MC, a combination of decorations matched by almost no other man in the war, for repeated acts of extreme gallantry while recovering wounded under fire, entirely unarmed. Hardy's case is instructive. He was 54 years old when he first went to France. He was, by any conventional military measure, an absurd figure on a battlefield. Elderly, physically slight, dressed in vestments rather than fighting kit, carrying nothing more lethal than a walking stick. And yet he returned, again and again, into ground swept by machine gun fire and shell bursts, to reach men who were dying. German soldiers who observed him at work, and there are accounts suggesting some did, appear to have made the same calculation as their counterparts in the sniper posts. This was not a target. The comparison with the German equivalent is illuminating. German military chaplains, Feldgeistliche, served in comparable roles and wore similarly distinctive insignia. The German army's approach was in many ways a mirror of the British one. Chaplains were non-combatants, were marked as such, and were theoretically protected under the same informal conventions. Yet the record suggests that British snipers, too, extended the same hesitation to their German counterparts in clerical garb. The phenomenon was, in this sense, genuinely reciprocal. An unspoken bilateral agreement reached not by generals or diplomats, but by men in mud-filled holes. acting on something older and deeper than orders. The Americans, arriving on the Western Front in significant numbers from 1917 onwards, brought their own chaplaincy tradition. The Army Chaplain Corps had existed since the Revolutionary War, but their uniforms were less immediately distinctive at range. American chaplains wore modified officers' uniforms with cross insignia, but the visual impact at distance was less pronounced than the British vestments over uniform approach. Several American chaplains noted in their diaries the relative clarity of the British system, and some adopted elements of it informally. What the British had developed, entirely by accident, was a system of visual identification so legible that it communicated across the most extreme conditions of the battlefield. Through rifle scopes, across shell-churned ground, in the grey morning light before proper visibility. The uniform did not need to say "do not shoot" in any language. It said it visually, exploiting a recognition that was apparently hardwired into even the most combat-brutalized mind. The legacy of this strange phenomenon is difficult to quantify precisely. We cannot know how many chaplains survived because of the informal protection their uniforms afforded. The counterfactual is, by definition, unknowable. What we can say is that chaplains moved through environments that would have killed ordinary soldiers, often daily, and that their survival rates, while not miraculous, were sufficiently high to attract comment from commanders and medical officers throughout the war. Surviving examples of the British Army chaplain's uniform from the First World War can be found at the National Army Museum in London and at the Imperial War Museum. They are, to modernize, oddly elegant objects, dark cloth of decent quality, carefully maintained, bearing the marks of hard use. The collar tabs with their distinctive crosses are small things to have carried a man across open ground under fire. But there they are, proof that the uniform existed, proof that it was worn. The tradition did not end in 1918. Chaplains served in the Second World War under the same basic principles, wearing the same identifying insignia, and reports from that conflict suggest that the informal convention persisted in some theatres, though the nature of the fighting, more mobile, more aerial, more industrial still, made the personal recognition that underpinned the original phenomenon far less reliable. By Korea and beyond, the battlefield had become too fragmented, too fast-moving, too anonymous for the visual grammar of the chaplain's collar to carry the weight it once had. But in that specific window of time, those mud-locked years on the Western Front, when the war had settled into something almost geological in its stillness, the uniform worked. It exploited a gap in the machinery of killing, the gap where a human being still had to decide, personally, whether to pull a trigger. And in that gap, something extraordinary persisted. Go back to that figure moving across the open ground near Passchendaele, the German sniper watching him through his optic, the finger resting on the trigger guard rather than the trigger itself. The pause that lasts a beat too long, and then the quiet decision, not this one. We will never know that sniper's name. We will never know precisely what he was thinking in that moment, or how he reconciled the world he had been asked to inhabit. A world of calculated killing, of range cards and wind readings and patient professional death. With the instinct that stayed his hand, we know only the outcome. The figure walked on. The rifle was lowered. In a war that killed 17 million people, that is a very small thing. But it happened not once, not by accident, and not without significance. It happened because men on both sides of that wire, however degraded and diminished by years of slaughter, held onto something, some recognition that the man in the dark uniform with the cross at his collar was doing something that existed outside the logic of the war, tending to the dying, burying the dead, praying for both sides, The most effective armor the British Army deployed on the Western Front was not steel. It was not leather or wool or any manufactured material. It was the accumulated moral weight of 2,000 years of Christian civilization, stitched into a collar tab and worn in plain sight. And it worked.